So thanks so much for having me today. I'm really excited to talk to you about it. So Her Kajal Won't Smudge is a podcast where I'm interviewing Desi women who are challenging social norms and expectations, biases in society that hold women back. And the women I'm interviewing are from all walks of life, all countries in South Asia, different religions, and they're all talking about social norms in different forms. So they're filmmakers, they're influencers, they're street protesters, and the social norms that they're talking about are being addressed really, I think, because it's a kind of blueprint of society. These are unwritten rules about how women are expected to conduct themselves. So there are rules around sort of who is a good daughter, who is a good wife, who is a good mother. And so the women who I'm interviewing are really looking at this from lots of different angles. And the podcast is about amplifying their voices and about bringing them together, aggregating them in one space. This is actually something that is quite important to me, this idea that, we include the diaspora voices, because I think that so often when there are these conversations around what's happening in South Asia, we don't think about the fact that the diaspora is also affected by things such as social norms, because social norms get passed down by word of mouth generationally, and they travel wherever South Asians may go, which is why when you and I are sitting here and discussing this, we can relate to what women on the streets of Pakistan are talking about, because these norms travel and they are as pervasive for us in our lives here as they are for women in Pakistan or India or Bangladesh. So the issues really are being driven by what women are talking about. So if we look at what's happening in Pakistan with Aurat March, what's really interesting for me is that women aren't talking about kind of changing laws or like changing institutional or political systems. They're really talking about what's very personal to them, and they're talking about the importance of changing the mindset. And for example, why is society always telling women what they can and cannot do? Women are thinking sentient beings. We birth you, we raise you, we teach you. And I think that, women do all these jobs. They are doctors, they're lawyers, they're shopkeepers, and they're in all walks of life. And yet, the idea of a woman talking about her autonomy and her ability to make her own decisions is considered to be a really controversial issue. So we look at that, right? That's a big issue for us. Another big issue for us is gender violence. Why is it that when a rape occurs, there is so much talk about what the woman was wearing or how she was at fault, how she shouldn't have been outside? I mean, these are really important issues to look at and deconstruct and talk about, because, for example, in Pakistan, a man rapes a woman every 2 hours. In India, a man rapes a woman every 15 minutes. In Bangladesh, every 4 days. I mean, there is really a serious problem here. So when, in the case of Pakistan, women are protesting at Aurat March and at many other times of the years when these terrible sort of heinous crimes happen, these women are not saying something that's fringe or radical. They're actually saying something that's very important and that needs to change in society. When you look at what's happening online, it's an incredible space to visit, because once the algorithm starts to understand what your interests are, you start to see the magnitude of what's happening. And we're talking not just women, but also men. And what they're talking about is, again, about social norms and expectations, but they're talking about, for example, the double standards, the way that a woman's marriage is supposed to be sort of the pinnacle of her life. And yet for men, it's about finding the right wife so they can continue with their career. They can follow those dreams. Why are those double standards there? There are conversations around, this ideal of a Desi woman whose beauty is defined by how white her skin is. or about the fact that she should be thin. You know, these are stereotypes and concepts around beauty that really diminish women's lives and how they view themselves. And what's also very interesting about what's happening online is that it's not only the women who are talking about this. You know, there are plenty of men who are posting really interesting content. And online, what's being posted is being posted every day. So whereas street protest is intermittent, you can see new content being posted every day because there's an appetite for it. And there are millions of people following Instagrammers who are putting out this stuff and TikTokers who are putting out this content. So it's got to, and that's why, you know, I think when it comes to what issues are being addressed, they're being driven by what's happening online and on the streets. In the first season, I've interviewed two Pakistanis, one Pakistani-American and three Indian women. From Pakistan, I've interviewed Shima Kirmani, who, you know, is an icon of Pakistani feminism, and she's been interviewed numerous times. And so for me, what I was really interested in was talking to her about a performance she did during Audit March a couple of years ago. In this performance, she was on stage with other women, and they did this militaristic dance, which is called And the Rapist Is You. It's actually a Chilean song and dance, which went viral a few years ago, and it has been translated into like 50 languages. You know, it's an incredible performance piece. But I was mesmerized by the fact that Shima performed this in Pakistan in Urdu. And so I wanted to talk to her about that because this is a woman who's used dance as her weapon of resistance for 40 years. I mean, for people who are unfamiliar with her history, I mean, she stood up to Zia al-Haq, you know, a military dictator who banned public dance. And she continued to dance because, as she says in her interview with me, you know, who gives anyone the right to take away my right to dance? I'm paraphrasing, but and so I've had the honor of interviewing her. Then I interviewed Mariam Shafkat Guraya, and Mariam has a Facebook page called Naik Praveen Syndrome, and in it she posts videos of herself, you know, in this kind of make-believe character, Naik Praveen. And Mariam's big issue is she wants people to talk about women who are the foot soldiers of patriarchy. And I thought this was such an interesting concept because, you know, we've all come across women who are like that. And here is, you know, Mariam using kind of satire and humor and performance art, I guess, to make the point. Then I interviewed Sabah Banu Malik. I don't know if you've heard of her. She's a radio jockey. She's an activist. She's a comedian. And what really drew me to asking for her time is that she's a Pakistani American. So, you know, for women of the diaspora, I think when we visit Pakistan, or if it's India or Bangladesh, we are tourists, right? I mean, we go there to visit our families. We may speak the language, we enjoy the food, we know the culture. But when it comes to what we see around us, we look at it from sort of a tourist's eyes, right? So I wanted to ask Sabah what she has experienced, what she sees about the treatment of women. So she was my third interview from Pakistan. And then from India, I've interviewed Lisa Mangaldas, who is a really big name in India. I mean, she has millions of followers and she's a sex educator. And I wanted to interview her because she wrote a book called The Sex Book. And to my surprise, in her glossary, she has words like patriarchy, internalized oppression, casteism. So I thought, my goodness, why would a sex educator include these kinds of concepts? And that's what we discussed in the interview. Then I interviewed Priyanka Paul, and Priyanka is, and these are her words, she describes herself as a dark-skinned, fat, queer, Dalit, who is of the Christian faith. And she makes beautiful art. She's an illustrator. She's also a TED Talk speaker, and she's been interviewed for Gucci Chime for Change. And she addresses all of these intersectional aspects of her feminism, and that's what we discuss. And then there is Radhika Vaz, and Radhika is a comedian, she's an author, and I wanted to interview her because she wrote this book called Unladylike. And when I read it, I thought, this is a comedian who actually mines material by thinking about the Desi female condition. And I thought that would be an amazing conversation to have, because again, it's about how she is looking at women, right? She's looking at society, looking at women. And so that was a great conversation too. So those are the women I interviewed in the first season. In the second season, I'm hoping to interview my first male feminist. And I would love to interview Nida Manzoor. I don't know if you've heard of her. She's a director. She directed and I think probably wrote Polite Society, which was a movie that came out. I watched it here in London. And I'll give it a little plug. It's like Matrix. So there's lots of martial arts, but the protagonists are Desi women, and they're fighting social norms around women's fertility, and they're kind of taking on concepts around marriage. So it's really worth seeing, and it would be great to interview Nida. So, makeup and women, it's a complicated subject, right? But for us, as we were thinking about names, we wanted to find something that would be a kind of symbol of resistance. And so while we were sitting together and we had this sort of internal kind of workshop to try to think of how do we come up with a name? And in thinking about these symbols, I had a pen. So I see that as my symbol of resistance. A friend of mine had her red lipstick. Another friend had her boxing gloves. So we knew we wanted a metaphor. And so Her Kajal Won't Smudge is a metaphor for the resilience, the determination, the courage of the women who I'm interviewing, because they keep going, and it's about capturing that. And I think also for me, it means it's got a meaning which is similar to like war paint, it has that sort of grittiness to it. And I think for some women, putting on their eyeliner or their kajal before they go to work is about kind of facing the day. So it has all these sort of different ways that you can look at it. And for women who don't wear makeup, I think it's just about understanding that we were looking for a metaphor that had something to do with South Asia. So this is a good question. I mean, I was one of these women who thought that I was a feminist because I was making money and I had a career and I was living on my own. And then I think, you have some knocks in life and you start to kind of see things in different ways. And for me, when I had my daughter, I realized that even working in London, or working in New York, working in big corporate environments, I realized that there's really not much room for mothers, and that for mothers who do stay and do continue to climb that corporate ladder, they have a really heavy price to pay for it personally. And so I knew that patriarchy exists in the workplace, but I think I was taken aback when during COVID, I saw myself really playing a very stereotypical role, one which my husband and I would not have had but for COVID, right? And so I started thinking, well, why has this happened? How has it happened? And then after COVID, I continued to kind of think about this question. And then I started looking at social media differently. And then I started researching, and I have a degree in economics. So I put on my economics hat and I started reading all the economic literature I could find in development economics, in labor economics, to try to understand, well, why is this issue of what are the issues for women in South Asia? And what are the economists saying about it? Because this is what they do as a career. This is what they look at every day. And so I think Her Kajal Won't Smudge, came out of that. So this is actually a great question because I think that there's been a lot of work done around this too. Um, when men hear the word gender or patriarchy or sexism, they turn off. And I think that men have a gender and men are affected by sexism and by patriarchy. So, for example, if we look at Disney, because that's what they are, we know that in those situations, a male member of a family has to make a very difficult decision. And we're talking about, for example, a brother who's told that his sister is posting something or, doing something which is bringing dishonor to the family. And that brother decides that he has to kill his sister. I mean, imagine the thinking that has to happen. Imagine the pressure that man is under. So patriarchy doesn't serve men either. And I also think that, in the home environment, if a man is seeing that his wife is struggling with, say, childcare or cooking or whatever it may be, lend a hand. I mean, I think patriarchy is the only thing stopping you from lending that hand. You're not going to be less of a man for doing it. So I think that kind of conversation is stuff that we talk about in the podcast. And I'm hoping that there will be male listeners and there will be views that people don't agree with. There will be things said that I think will shock some listeners. And that's fine, because the only thing I think we can ask is that we give people the space, we give women the space to have their own opinions. And so I'm hoping that, if men listen to it, they will see something from a different perspective. Maybe if you've got a minute, I can share this kind of anecdote. So I recently watched a documentary of a Pakistani squash player named Maria Turpakai Wazir. And this documentary, she talks about how she was always outside playing sports, right? That was her thing. And around the age of 16, her parents said to her, look, enough is enough. You got to start wearing girl clothes. And that's it. So her parents went out to dinner one day and she burnt all her girl clothes. She cut off her hair. And when her father came back, he said, well, if you want to live like a man, we'll give you a man's name. So he named her Genghis Khan, and she started playing sports professionally. And eventually she had to show her passport or her identity card somewhere, and they discovered that she's a boy. And once that happened, the Taliban came after her. And so for 2 years, she had to live indoors, and she talked about playing squash against the wall in her bedroom, right? Because she was worried about her family. And I thought about this, and I spoke to a man I know who is a lawyer, and for him, law is his calling, right? So I spoke to him and I said, imagine if you were unable to be a lawyer unless you dressed as a woman. You had to pretend to be a woman so you could practice law. And as I said that to him, I thought, for men, these stories that are being talked about in the podcast, they can also create a sense of empathy. And I think that empathy is very important in this conversation. I think the challenges I faced are not dissimilar from what Desi's face in the UK or in the US. There are those questions, where are you from? Where are you actually from? Those kind of things. But frankly, at this point in my life, I don't see them as making me hammer, because they were more reflective of the person who's asking the question than of me. So that's how I look at it. So, I mean, for British Pakistani women, recently I read some data which was kind of surprising, or not surprising, I guess, from 2022. And it showed that in London, Pakistani and Bangladeshi women are the least employed out of all ethnic categories. And I think that behind those figures is probably of social norms and expectations about what women are supposed to do, when they're supposed to get married, have children, etc. And so I think that probably one of the biggest issues facing Pakistani women is if they have dreams and aspirations and they are limited by their family's views about what that woman is supposed to be doing with her life, then that is a very big challenge. I also think that there are issues with domestic violence. I mean, there are a range of issues I think that British Pakistani women face. And they're all very serious. I mean, it's a difficult question. I think that so much of this is very individual and very personal. So I think that, how much are you willing to go through for your independence? I mean, the women I've interviewed, there's some women I've talked to who've said, that it was their parents who supported them and they've had that behind them to do whatever they wanted, right? For other women, they had to go it alone. She faced a lot of backlash within her own family, and now they've come around. So I think it's a question of how much what a woman is willing to kind of go through to make those types of decisions in her life. I think that living in the UK or in the US, we're quite fortunate because we will have role models around us, we'll have teachers around us, and we'll have people we can ask for help if we want to apply to that university or we want to get that grant or whatever it might be. So that is available. And if a woman feels that she has something she really wants to pursue, then there are those ways available to her to try to make that happen. But it's a very personal question, I think.
Makes sense.
Oh, and I want to say in terms of the women who are in danger, I mean, on that front, don't live with physical danger. The fear of shame is not going to help you. It's not going to save your life. It's a situation where I think for a lot of Desi women, they don't want to go to the police because there's so much stigma associated with it. But I think that online there are lots of active organizations that work to help women. So you don't have to go to the police if you don't want to. Well, this is also another really big question. When it comes to blame, I think what you mean by that is kind of victim shaming, all of moral policing and all of that. So I think there are two ways to look at this. One way is to say that men are just change about who men are. And I think that approach, which is sort of the way that society functions right now in Pakistan, that approach doesn't take into account all the costs of taking that view. So, the rape statistics are very high, and each statistic is a woman who will have gone through shame, depression, maybe suicide. So there's that cost. And then there's the cost that women can't really use outdoor spaces. So you're talking about 50% of a society who feel unsafe going out, and not just at night, but to go get groceries, to run an errand, whatever it is. So this is a very big cost, I think, overall to society, to Pakistani society. The second way of looking at this question is to say, well, men are not rabid animals who can't learn anything. It's to say that it's a question of how do we create education around these issues? How do we talk about gender in the curricula in Pakistan? I don't know if it's included, but I think this is the way that we can help make change around these issues, because otherwise what happens is that when a woman is raped, the blame is placed on her, and people ask the question, what was she wearing? Where was she? Why was she out at night? And that type of policing of women is something which many people have looked at. And one of my favorite authors is a woman named Kate Mann. She's a professor at Cornell, and she has posed she has kind of helped me see things a bit differently, and I'll share it with you. So I used to think of misogyny as woman hating, but in fact, what she has helped me understand is that misogyny is the policing arm, if you will, of sexism. So if sexism is like a man in a lab coat walking around saying there are distinct differences between men and women, and that is just the way things are. And if a woman steps out of line, so for example, if a woman rejects a proposal, then acid attacks might happen, right? Honor killing might happen. And that's because that woman has stepped out of line. And so she is going to be policed by society. And I think it's really telling that, for example, in Islamabad, when there was this terrible rape that happened at a park not too long ago, the man who raped her said, well, you shouldn't have been out at night. You know, in the case of Jyoti Singh in 2012, which was this terrible, brutal rape and murder that happened, the rapist was interviewed and he said, well, good girls don't go out at night. So there is this policing of women that happens. And I think Kate Mann's framework is very useful because it helps us make sense of what is happening. And it also helps us understand that when we talk about victim shaming, there's a lot that goes with that, right? So it is something that we can look at, we can address, we can talk about, and we can help change. I think there is a lot to be said for having conversations. And I think that, you know, the more we talk about this, the more we'll normalize it. And if we look at how in the UK or in the US, how women have been able to normalize conversations around this, it's by protesting. It's by, in the case of what we're doing now, about this topic. And I think for me personally, it's a daily process. So, you know, in my own marriage, I often catch myself and I catch my husband, you know, saying things and having expectations which are kind of which are kind of keeping those social norms in place. And so we have conversations about those. So I think that the best thing we can do is to talk about them. This kind of idea that women are the nurturers, but you know, I've had lots of very nurturing men in my life. I'm sure you have too. I think all around us, we see examples of that in South Asian society. So this idea that, you know, women are the nurturers, that also, I think, does a disservice to men because it means that they don't also get to experience the full extent of what it might be like to have a family life, you know? And so it's time to have conversations around that because it serves both men and women to talk about these things. So, you know, it's a curious idea, right? I mean, is it possible to live through a full-blown revolution and like not even know it, right? And I would say there's so much going on right now on social media, which we've talked about, but also in terms of the kinds of TV dramas and films that are being made. You know, it is reflective of an appetite in society. That's true in India and in Bangladesh. I just recently watched a film called Rihanna, which is brilliant. And it's written by a man, it's directed by a man, but it's addressing, again, social issues, social norms. And so, you know, when there's so much happening, it makes you wonder, you know, are we living through something which is a liberation movement for women? But I think I'm hoping that you'll listen to Her Kajal Won't Smudge, you'll listen to the conversations that we're having, and you will decide for yourself.